Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, again to our podcast, Classical Discoveries. And Jens, we are coming similar now to Christmas and have a special composer for Mr. Engelbert Humperdinck.
Engelbert Humperdinck, finally. Famous, of course, for Release Me.
For what?
No?
No, I don't know.
Oh, I prepared for the wrong Humperdinck.
If you googled the wrong Engelbert Humperdinck, okay, I show you now the right one. Okay. So Jens, now I have to do by my own everything now because you are prepared for the how do you say Schlagerstar or for the
A pop star.
A pop star.
From British India.
And he's the same spelling, Engelbert Humperdinck.
Well, he named himself after the classical composer.
Ah, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So his name is something completely different.
He was a fan?
Must have been a fan.
Okay.
Maybe his parents took him to the opera, or maybe he was in London in 1923,
okay,
when the Royal Opera House did its first ever radio broadcast of an opera, and it was Hansel and Gretel.
Oh, really? Okay. But we are talking now beside Mr. Hansel and Mrs. Gretel, because Engelbert Humperdinck had so much other music to show us.
I know.
But you told me that he was he loved Christmas. Was it really like this?
Apparently. I mean, Christmas certainly features heavily in Hansel and Gretel.
Mm-hmm.
He later on did an opera called Christmas Dream.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And we have The Blue Bird, which is a Christmas tale.
Okay.
So he was milking that topic heavily.
And Mr. Humperdinck was really a close friend of the famous Richard Wagner. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that comes a little later. I mean, there's another composer he's related to in that he was a student, and of course it's a favorite of ours, or mine anyway,
okay,
and a Capriccio favorite, Rheinberger.
Ah, Rheinberger, yeah.
When he went to Munich, he studied with Rheinberger.
Okay. Uh-huh.
And then subsequently he went to Italy.
Okay.
And in Venice he met Wagner.
Okay. Uh-huh.
And he duly impressed Wagner, and then Wagner took him on as his production assistant, essentially, for the Bayreuth performance of Parsifal in 1880-81.
Okay.
And he was part of that close-knit group that prepared the score and the production.
Ah, really? Okay. Uh-huh. Did he also conduct Parsifal then later on? I don't know.
No, he was not. Levi was the Parsifal conductor.
Okay. Okay. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And then he went on a sojourn to Italy, Spain, Morocco even, where he did some drafts for a piece that he later composed. And then he didn't really get that much into conducting until you told me that his sister asked him for Christmas to write a couple songs.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And those turned then eventually into Hansel and Gretel.
Yeah, he should write for a school performance some of Hansel and Gretel, some little songs for the kids. But then finally, this theme, fascinated him so much. So. Right.
And you can already see, even though we're trying to talk about Humperdinck beyond Hansel and Gretel, there's no not talking about Hansel and Gretel when it comes to Humperdinck, because it is such a dominant piece in his output. It's why everyone knows him.
Absolutely.
And hardly anyone knows him for anything else. Although he wrote quite a few operas, and there's really one more opera of his that is sort of known, Die Königskinder.
Die Königskinder, yes.
Which is a lot of fun. So I think of it as Parsifal for children.
Okay.
But he wrote Sleeping Beauty, and he wrote The Reluctant Marriage, and The Provision Near, and Gaudeamus.
Okay.
And I don't think any of those have been recorded.
But the interesting thing for me in his biography is that when Wagner died, he was so frustrated that he he didn't wrote any note for 7 years.
That was the time prior to
Yeah.
Hansel Gretel. Yeah.
Prior to Hansel Gretel, and he as I told already, he was in Spain, and then maybe interesting for our German followers, he was a pianist in Alfred Krupphaus, the famous steel magnate. So he needed money, whatever. But we are talking now today. I want to focus now on one big piece, and it's called the Miracle. And we are talking about his last 10 years. So he was already successful a long time with Hansel and Gretel, and he was settled and everything. And again, this name comes over and over in our podcasts. This was a collaboration with Max Reinhardt. And first of all, I think, oh my God, all this mystery plays. Also, the Miracle is a kind of a pantomime into acts and an epilogue and all this. If you read the story, you say, oh my God. I mean, okay, the church, the Catholic Church, that time they had millions more on followers. So
a few more than we do.
A few more than we do, yes. But anyway, these big mysterious plays have been so successful. It was first premiered in London in 1911, and Max Reinhardt was famous for a huge cast. So he had choruses of more than 200 people, dancers and singers, and sometimes have been engaged more than 2,000 people for such a performance. And they toured with that. Really, they toured with that from to Spain, to Switzerland, to Sweden, even through the First World War. They played in Switzerland and Sweden, and finally also New York. They played this huge piece on the Broadway for more than 1 year. That's amazing. So, what is the miracle, or what is the mystery on the Miracle?
Well, the miracle is that he was still able to make money with such a big cast in touring.
Of course, yeah.
And also, I mean, we'll continue in a second, but it's not the only time he collaborated with Max Reinhardt. He also did the incidental music for The Merchant of Venice with him.
Yeah.
Of which I don't think there's a recording either.
No, I don't know. No, not either. And it was also so successful that Max Reinhardt already he made a film about in 1912, and I could find some little excerpts sometimes, so please accept the quality, because this is really a movie from 1912 without any sound. So the story short is a nun falls in love to a knight, and she escapes from the cloister.
And she gets seduced?
Then she gets seduced, yeah, genau. Then she comes to different ways in the world to... She gets pregnant, yes. Okay, thank you. I thought you were hungry.
That too.
Okay. And finally then, when she had all these horrible things in her daily life, she returned to the cloister. Yeah.
It's a little bit like the beginning of the Faust 1.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
And then she loses the child.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And she runs back to the cloister, and then there's a whole subplot with the statue of the Virgin Mary in the church that comes alive and sort of takes her place intermittently. Yeah, and then finally she has the child in her arms, and it's really baby Jesus.
So in our ears today we would say, oh my God, what a story, But there was this famous, who was the libretto? The Carl Gustav Vollmöller. Carl Gustav Vollmöller was that time a very famous author, but he had not write so much to this because it's a pantomime, and most of the texts are church songs. So Humperdinck just instrumentated very famous church songs on this. But there is a lot of dramatic in the music. There is a lot of holiness, or how to say,
spirituality,
whatever. Even the story might be a bit crazy obscure for us today. We have wonderful music on it.
It's another thing is, I mean, Max Reinhardt is responsible for the careers, partially anyway, of quite a lot of composers, and so disparate. Korngold and Weil, and now Humperdinck.
Yeah. So we have we have more than 40 tracks on this, although we cannot go all through. I just want to pick out some dramatical excerpts. As I told you already, this all is in the beginning and in the end very holy. And there are famous church songs. I don't know if you also know this kind of church songs in the English talking languages, but maybe
A lot of them have been.
maybe. Just listen a bit to the procession of the first act. So that's the first Christmas song, no? I don't know. Do you know? No, we don't know this in English countries, no? There's literally Dumper, or
No, but it's a really famous Austrian song, and it fits almost perfectly to that orchestration.
So the procession, and you have to imagine that there, for sure, Max Reinhardt had 100 nuns and a choir of 200, you know. So, and they're going out of the church. But there are also dramatical moments like this Megildis. I don't know who comes on the name Megildis. Couldn't it be Susan, or I don't know, or but Megildis, whatever is the name.
It sounds very German.
Megildis, is it old German?
Probably, yeah. So she jumped out of the Nibelung saga or something like that.
Yeah, Nibelung saga in Catholic Church. Okay. When she is challenging the mother, or you said, you translated it, Megildis is challenge the mother. So she's fighting to stay in the...
Fighting, maybe struggling, but was she resisting? There's the statue of the Virgin Mary. And she is struggling with whether or not to follow her heart or her calling to serve the church.
Of course. That's the perfect way. I could not do it better.
Glad to help.
Yeah, there's a lot of Wagner in him, no?
Yeah, I'd say.
Would say, no? 20 horns and you know.
Certainly not lacking for instruments.
Max Reinhardt had 20 horns, I'm sure. You know. So, but finally then he fall in love with the knight, you know, and he said, okay, please escape me from here.
I think the knight comes and knocks on the door and then finds out.
Genau.
It's a bit elaborate, but can't you imagine a big Hollywood film set to that music with lots of costumes, like a sort of Ivanhoe type of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say that she must be very happy to escape. No?
And she's taken a merry time. I mean, it's not exactly rushed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But we always have such big kind of Catholic themes. Also, Reinhardt had these. Was this just to very inspiring then for the people there, and to watch 2 hours to such a monster thing?
Well, people at the time were used to being in church for quite a while.
Yeah.
So, and I suppose if it's gonna be religious, this is more entertaining than just hearing the priest go on forever.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
No, but I think, I mean, religion was obviously so much more pervasive in society that it was just good business sense to combine the two. And it must have had an appeal. And I mean, he didn't stick just to Catholicism, Max Reinhardt, obviously, with Kurt Weill and the Prophets, that goes in a different direction. And it's hard for us now to imagine what it must have been like for audiences then, but I suppose it's in this sense it's an extension of the Catholic procedure, because you've got spectacle, which the Catholic Church is good at, plus seductive music, which they were also good at. So it's really not that far away.
No, but the funny thing is, I mean, this was a Broadway show, you know. We are talking now about a Broadway show from...
except for the line of dancing nuns. No, but we're making fun of it a little bit, and we shouldn't. But I wonder how seriously he took it, how devout that was. Maybe it was a serious play on Broadway.
Yeah, it was, of course, very serious. I mean, also the movie is very, very serious at this point, you know.
Right.
So you could not make a comical thing.
This is not a musical comedy.
No, Mel Brooks was not born yet. So, but finally, I give you some samples now when she's out in the world and she get abducted.
and at that point, the story, I said earlier, Faust, but here it becomes more like Candide or something of that sort. One horrible thing happens to her after another. But whoever does anything horrible to her, something yet still more horrible happens to them, until she finally gets back to the knight, and then something horrible happens to him. But it just gets worse and worse. It's not comical, but almost.
It's a Breaking Bad from 1911. Okay. Okay, and then comes a very interesting composed dance, a kind of fire dance. I have the feeling it's like a bit a copy of Salome Dance of the Seven Veils.
But it precedes that, because this came out in
1911.
Oh, no, okay, so Salome came 6 years before that.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like Strauss meets the other Strauss.
Yeah.
And then in the end, it's almost a little bit like Mendelssohn.
Yeah.
Midsummer Night's Dream, that sort of.
Midsummer Night's Dream, yeah.
And speaking of Strauss, the Richard one, not the Johann one, he conducted the premiere of Hänsel and Gretel, incidentally.
No, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Okay. Richard Strauss conducted the world premiere of Hänsel, not Humperdinck himself?
No.
Oh, really? Okay. I love it when all this comes together, all the boys and girls in the same time. Oh my God. No, but anyway, I mean, this music was never recorded before. I think it's absolutely worth to hear also this kind of Mr. Humperdinck, because there's so much diversity in his music. And of course, he always was a composer who stayed very romantic, so he was not open to new age music like Schoenberg or so.
No, but ironically, what hampered his career in part anyway was his association with Wagner.
Yeah.
In that he had started out very conservative with the likes of Reinberger, but then he was forever associated with the new German school, so Wagner, even though he didn't really, it doesn't sound like Liszt, let's put it that way.
Yeah, of course. So, but finally she's coming home back and she's pregnant.
Not only is she pregnant, she has already given birth.
And she has already given birth, you're right. You wrote the booklet better than me. So this is Suffering with Mr. Humperdinck.
Very much a dirge.
Yeah, really, he would have been a fantastic film composer. We had already now Schweker should have been film composer, Humperdinck now should have been film composer. I mean, at the end he was his own film composer,
right,
for the things. And for everyone who misses Christmas or the big choirs, whatever, then comes the Christmas Eve in the cloister. What could be more Christmas than from combination of From Heaven Above I Come and then Max Reger's Gretel song, Maria's Gretel song? Okay, here he was the instrumentator of that piece.
Right, it's like, is it an homage or is it plagiarism?
Yeah.
But it's a nifty little combination of those two.
Absolutely, and nothing can describe Christmas more than the combination like both of this, So, but then finally at the end then comes the retransformation of the Mother of God and the transformation of the child that became then suddenly a child of the statue.
And she's forgiven and everything is fine and she retains her initial job.
Absolutely, so...
It's like the prodigal son also.
Yeah, it's like a kind of prodigal son, absolutely right. I never thought that you studied theology.
I did, actually.
Oh, really? Oh, okay, I said nothing bad. So I play a bit now for the final chorus, which is again a Catholic pick. Okay, again you have to imagine 2,000 people on stage. I just got the theory that maybe also the audience became a little chorus because they are so popular.
Oh, so they could sing along?
Yeah, they could sing along. Yeah, they also could sing along. Yeah?
In certain countries?
Yeah, this is...
Like a Bach Passion?
Everything together. Yeah. Really? They did it with Bach Passion? To sing,
well, the chorales.
The chorales, of course, yeah. That's chorales, yeah. But not the arias.
No, well, it's for advanced congregations.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you like something for Christmas or a bit in Christmas style, I really would love to recommend you now this Miracle. And we had already last year or 2 years ago, when was it? We had another piece from Mr. Humperdinck recorded in 2021.
Also Christmas?
Also Christmas, The Blue Bird. So the first disc is more for German listeners. So
because it comes with a narration.
As a lot of narration.
Of another strange story.
But for kids.
For kids, very fantastical, very...
For kids, it's a Christmas
charming
fantasy play, whatever. Mm-hmm.
And just to tell listeners a little bit how the sausage gets made, you figured a disc with a lot of German narration is going to be a hard sell in non-German speaking countries. Mm-hmm. You asked the conductor to put together a symphonic suite that's added as a bonus on a second CD.
Yes.
So it's all music, no interruptions.
No interruptions, wonderful to listen. I mean, if you listen it with children, you can listen the first CD. If you like to listen it in a Christmas dinner, listen only the orchestral versions,
A listener's digest.
A listener's digest, yes.
Another interesting bit is, as we have already talked about in our last podcast with Schrager, who the students were of Humperdinck.
Okay.
Because they're incredibly disparate types of composers. There's, for one, Siegfried Wagner, which makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Leo Blech. Yeah.
Leo Blech, okay.
Kurt Weill.
No, I don't believe really.
Can't you hear it?
Max the Knife.
Cyril Scott, which maybe our English listeners might know. Oscar Fried, whom we've also recorded. Mm-hmm. And another conductor, Karl Schuricht.
Ah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And with the Blue Bird in the bag and the Miracle covered, I think that was it for Humperdinck today.
Yes, this was it now for Humperdinck.
I mean, isn't he lovely?
He is absolutely lovely, okay.
In fact, it is. So all that remains to say is, so finally, kiss and say goodbye until we see you again for our next podcast.
Kiss and say goodbye, okay. Wonderful, thank you. See you next.